Jim Willis, Marcellus Drilling News, editor and founder.
Levels look great. Appreciate you joining the program here today. And, wanted to find out what's going on up in the Marcellus. A little bit different than the other shale plays. Hasn't been getting a lot of news these days nationally, but I imagine there's always something going on in the Marcellus. So thanks for joining the program today. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Jason. Thanks for having me on. Yeah.
Let's start with, kind of a state of the union, state of the Marcellus, and then transition into what your number one story right now is.
Sure thing. As I look out over the landscape and, considering what I've been writing about and what I hear about and what people are interested in reading, a couple of things have been happening. I suspect, like in other plays, like in the Bakken and the Permian and other plays, one of the big recurring stories that we have revolves around pipelines and opposition to pipelines, and it comes in various forms, primarily litigation that's been launched by environmental groups like the Sierra Club and others. Can
I interrupt you real quick there? I wanted to ask you while it was fresh in my mind. You brought that up because that has been a problem in the Bakken, specifically with the Davis Refinery. Meridian Energy Group has spent a year and a half, 2 years in litigation, and we've transitioned the conversation over the past year that more specifically the last probably 7 months, is that this is the new strategy to bleed them of their resources. Are you finding that's the case out there in the Marcellus too?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely the case. I would say nationwide, that's the strategy. If these groups can tie up these major projects for extra months or years, they're trying to run out the clock. And so this is, I've seen it in a number of major projects. It started more than 4 years ago, I guess maybe 5 years ago now, with a pipeline project out here that we call the Constitution Pipeline, which is supposed to run out of northeast Pennsylvania, Susquehanna County, up into the southern tier area of New York and through our area. And so I'm talking to you from the Binghamton, New York area. So as we joked, prior, Jason, I say that I live and I work behind enemy lines. So I'm writing about all this great stuff, but, the state that I live in, we can't partake of any of it. So our governor has opposed this pipeline coming up into the state, a pipeline that would deliver gas that we need here in the state and gas that would go on from our state to other states to New England. And so that began over 4 years ago, all of this business of delay, and then finally deny. So in this case, in the case of the Constitution, that was state government that was engaging in that. But now we're facing other major projects that have been delayed, and it's costing billions with a B tacked on to the cost of these projects, and is delaying them for months and years. So I'm talking about the Mountain Valley Pipeline that travels from southern West Virginia. Not southern West Virginia, Wetzel County, West Virginia, so southern part of the Panhandle area, and travels down through into Virginia, down to southern Virginia. And that project has been now delayed somewhat. It's 85 to 90% built, but it's still being delayed because of litigation that challenges U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service permit over 4 supposedly endangered species. And so that's holding things up there. Atlantic Coast Pipeline, Dominion Energy's Atlantic Coast Pipeline, 600-mile pipeline, major pipeline, again from West Virginia through Virginia into North Carolina, delivering badly needed supplies of natural gas into the South. And it was the same sort of strategy. So a couple of different lawsuits, one that challenged U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service permits, but another that challenged another government agency permit from the U.S. Forest Service that would allow the pipeline to cross under, not over, not through, but under the Appalachian Trail, and that particular lawsuit is actually now on appeal at the Supreme Court. So, these kinds of delays are literally costing several $billion more added. There are literally thousands of workers out of jobs right now, idled, because these companies cannot build these pipelines. So that's for me, that's a big deal. And it is a strategy. It's just this ongoing, opposition driven by whatever. I think it's driven by what I call an irrational hatred of fossil fuels.
Well, we've been covering this for about 5 years. We've called it the rise of environmentalism, to where in the past year we've just said it's a cult of environmentalism, and we're saying that from an anthropological standpoint. We're Webster's dictionary, anthropology 101, because there's this emotional attachment that is brought to an environment that people can relate to, and they romanticize about it. And it's a very dangerous path that's happened, because the environment should be very sterile. In my opinion, it should be more science than it should be. I mean, go out and enjoy it without a doubt, and get all of those spiritual and emotional attachments. But when you're talking about the actual black and white science part of it, that should be sterile science. It shouldn't be consensus science, or it shouldn't be this cult or this emotional attachment that's brought to it. I wanted to ask you about the state. And you can comment on my comment as well, but the state got involved, and with the state getting involved like this, do they have studies that are going to be shown or have shown that what the impact is going to be if these homes don't get that natural gas, or if they do get that natural gas, or do you know what I mean? Because they've gotten involved, you said. So what's their course? Is it political? Is it economic?
Well, it's both. The short answer is no. I don't believe I've seen any kind of studies on the part of the state, on the other side, saying that, aside from there have been, plethora of studies that have been funded by groups in our neck of the woods, like the William Penn Foundation and the Park Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation is sort of behind a lot of this stuff as well. So there have been very slanted, I would call them, studies, quote unquote, that support a position of anti-fossil fuels. But what we have in our state with our governor, with Andrew Cuomo, is a philosophy that at its core, and it's a philosophy, but in his case, I don't know, is it philosophy or is it I think maybe it's more politics than philosophy. We have a small, vocal group of people that challenge him and prod him and force him to act and react in a certain way. And so he's passing all sorts of and enacting all sorts of legislation and policies and executive orders and things like that demand that we be so, in our energy sector, for instance, our electricity, power gen, be, zero, like carbon neutral by 2050. We actually, this is mind-boggling, and most people don't understand it, don't even realize it yet, that live in this state. From Cuomo and through our state legislature, they've passed a law that is going to, if it stays enacted, and I seriously doubt it could, will cause everyone in this state that has an oil furnace, a gas furnace, a wood stove to heat with, that can't use them after, about 25 years from now. Because all energy sources have to be carbon neutral, quote unquote, and this is now the law of the land, and it's a breathtaking power grab, and I don't know how to explain it other than our Senate for years, for decades, traditionally had been a few seat majority, Republican controlled, and that flipped at the last election and has become Democrat controlled. And so the governor in both houses here, the Assembly and the Senate, are now in one party, and they're just ramming through everything they can possibly think of, in anticipation of the time when it changes again.
They're making changes like that. Is there talk about how they're going to replace those individuals that maybe can't afford a new heating system? I've heard so many different studies of how the Green New Deal is very discriminatory against the people who are economically challenged. But we used to call them poor people, but we don't call them that anymore. So this sounds very similar. It sounds like you're forcing people to upgrade, keep up with the Joneses in certain areas.
Yep, exactly. It's the only two things that they're just figuring out now. It's like an oh crap kind of a deal. How are we going to do this now that we've made this the law? And the only two things that I've really read anything about thus far are electric, of course, but also heat pumps, and things like that. So which are, phenomenally expensive systems to install. And I don't know. So it's again, I don't see how long term how this can actually. How it can actually not get reversed at some point. But I don't know. Stranger things have happened. It's like New York now is trying to be further left than California is, and it's become a bizarre race.
Do you have any idea why that is? Is it a political thing? I mean, because Colorado is doing the same thing.
Yeah, I guess it is. I mean.
What I mean is not necessarily the same exact laws, but they're bringing the ideology and they're bringing this whole new wave of stripping down industry is the only way I can really think of it. I mean, it really is. I mean, it's stripping it down in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime.
Here's the way I describe it to people, the overall philosophy and in my opinion, the injustice of all of this is to say this. So I live in Broome County, New York, which shares a border with Pennsylvania. 20 miles from where I sit, on the other side of that border in Pennsylvania, Susquehanna County, is the number one natural gas producing county in Pennsylvania. And over the past 10 years, Cabot Oil and Gas and several other companies that operate in Susquehanna County have invested in the way of signing bonuses and royalties and the money that they spend to do drilling in that county. Over $10 billion with a B. And it's just incredible. On this side of the border, in our local news media in Binghamton, you don't read a thing about it. And Governor Cuomo will, come off his throne and deign to grant us $1 million grant for this or that, and everyone falls all over themselves and thinks that's just how marvelous this is. And I'm saying, $10 billion, and we're settling for government pennies on this side of the border? I mean, that to me encapsulates the philosophy between the two.
You mentioned earlier, too, about some of the litigation on the pipeline side of things. Are you seeing protests, the old-fashioned protests, or is this mostly just now drain people of their resources? I call it hemorrhaging companies of their resources. You might remember this back in the 2007s, 8s, and 9s when the internet was starting to really take over a lot of the media. For those 3 years, it was who could last, really. Maybe it was even 4 or 5 years, heck, 10 years later. Because, newspapers, I give this example all the time. Newspapers in most cities had a monopoly for almost 100 years. And then the internet comes in, and within 10 years, they're declaring bankruptcy. That is a paradigm shift like we've never seen before. But through a process of that, there was a hemorrhaging that was going on to see who could withstand which regional company could withstand which regional, local, this and that and everything. It reminds me a lot of that. And you're in the media, so that's why I thought I'd bring up that example. And I don't know if you were around in the media when that was going on, but it just reminds me a lot of that, where companies are hang on, really.
Yeah. I actually started writing my site in 2009. So that's when I began to focus on this particular industry. I was involved for a number of years in different industries separate from the oil and gas industry. So I've sort of been learning as I go since that time. But you asked the question about protests and things like that, and not a lot. I mean, every time that I've observed protests, it's typically fairly small. And early on, talking about 5, 6, 7 years ago, early in the process for some of these pipelines, for instance, FERC might be in the area and do a scoping hearing, and I would go to that. And inevitably, it was the same script over and over in my mind. People that were anti-fossil fuel would show up, and I call it a circus freak show. They parade in front of the cameras and the microphones and make silly asses of themselves, if I can say that on your podcast or your radio show here. Sorry. And then the rest of the audience would be filled with landowners and people from the local union hall that actually want some decent jobs. And so typically it usually sorts out to be a fairly small number of people that are against. And yet, those 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 people get all the media play while, the audience of 3, 4, 500 are, mentioned or ignored. But I guess maybe that's the nature of the news beast.
How about in the world of innovation when it comes to your pipeline coverage and your pipeline news? There's a lot of different ways. I talked to a gentleman a couple weeks ago, pipeline silencers. He's got a piece of innovation equipment, that he sells to companies, and it helps the safety side of things, noise pollution, if you will. So there's all kinds of different slices to this whole thing, and that, to me, I love the whole capitalism side of this oil and gas industry. But how about when it comes to innovation? You can go nuts on the capitalism part too, but innovation. Have you guys been covering anything, or are you seeing anything from your coverage?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the easiest way to put that, and so there's technological innovations, but there are also process innovations in the way they've learned to do things. So once upon a time, they would, around here down in Pennsylvania, they would set up a drilling rig, and they, it would take 2 weeks to get it all assembled and in place, and they would start drilling, and they would drill a well that would be, say, I don't know, 5 or 6. It was maybe 4,000 or 5,000 feet. Trying to think back, what it used to be, and it would take them literally upwards of a month, to do something like that. And today, they set up on site and they begin drilling, and they will drill a horizontal well that goes 10 or 12 or 14,000 feet, and they'll get that sucker done inside of, maybe 2 weeks tops, maybe even sooner than that. So the technological innovations, the equipment that they're using, and the way that they're using their equipment, the style, their methodologies, That stuff has really revolutionized over the past 4 or 5 years, absolutely. And new innovations are coming in all the time. That's the one thing, I agree with you, that's the one thing that really jazzes me when I'm writing about the industry, is to see, I come across a new company that's doing something. Maybe it's a company that has developed a new super absorbent erosion dam or something that that makes it 10 times easier to prevent issues when they're drilling or putting a new road in or something like that. That kind of thing is happening all the time in this industry.
I'm not sure how much you go outside of your region, but down in Texas and some other areas in the Southwest, there's quite a few pipelines that are going to be opened up and online in the next year. Corpus Christi comes to mind, and as a big location for the end result of those. Then you've got Lake Charles, Louisiana. They've got all kinds of processing plants on the books, and there needs to get the supply there somehow. So how's for me, I'm looking at a big renaissance coming, especially in the natural gas side of things with pipelines. Once these completions are done up in the Bakken, they've got a bunch as well. But are you following it nationally, just kind of seeing that next level, that next big surge that's going to happen once these things come online?
Oh, yeah. I mean, just as a matter of course, I'm noticing, hopefully, sometimes the bigger picture and how it all ties together. So a couple of thoughts. Number one is that there's a fair amount of Marcellus and Utica molecules that actually go to the Lake Charles area. They travel down to Transco, and there may be one other pipeline that's helping with that in that respect. But they travel on down through, and from the research that I've done, somewhere over 300 million cubic feet per day of our gas is going to the Cheniere, Sabine Pass plant, and getting liquefied and shipped out of there. In addition to the fact that our molecules are flowing to the Maryland coast, to the Cove Point LNG export facility along Maryland. And all of that gas that goes out of there, half of it goes to Japan, the other half goes to India. So the pipelines are interconnecting, and also I also, in addition to doing what I'm doing for my own thing here, is I'm also, over a year now, I've been writing a monthly column for Compressor Tech 2 magazine. And in that column, I take a look at gas pipelines and compressors, anything of interest along those lines in all of the shale plays in the United States. So I've been tracking some of these projects that are coming out of the Permian, for instance, that are going to the Gulf Coast and out of the Haynesville, and yeah, we have a lot of capacity that's coming online soon, which is a really good thing. So if I could circle back to the very beginning when we started to talk, and you said, what are the big issues that you kind of see out there? Well, the other, aside from pipelines, the other big issue kind of plays into all of this, and that is, the price of gas has been in the basement for quite a while, and because of that, and for the same reasons this is happening for largely oil drillers, gas drillers are starting to pull back a little bit. They're not drilling quite as many new wells. They're still completing a lot of DUCs that they've had, drilled but uncompleted wells. So there's a fair bit of that going on. But the new mantra, I think, across the entire industry, oil and gas, is free cash flow. We've got to get free cash flow. We've got to make the investors happy, which of course you do have to do. And so what that means in our region, in the Marcellus and the Utica, is there's not quite as many permits being issued, not quite as much drilling going on now as there was, say, last year at this time.
What kind of impact is that having on companies? You know, rigs are down 20%. I'm hearing everything from, well, my business is down 10% because of it, but I've heard another guy who's found new ways to create revenue, and his business is up 40%. He's more on the technology side, and so he's finding that a lot of companies are becoming proactive now with this technology after 5, 6, 7 years of education. So, and most, I would say 80% of the companies I've talked to are just steady Eddie, just maybe 5% up and 5% down, not enough to really get too worried about it, type of a thing. But a few have mentioned that down or up. So are you hearing anything from any companies out there with, nationally rigs are down 20%, so it's no secret.
Well, I guess probably the poster child right now would be EQT. So EQT became the largest natural gas producing company in the United States a few years ago. I believe it was 2017 when they bought out and merged in Rice Energy. And they, far surpassed Chesapeake at that point. And of course, Chesapeake's been selling off some of their gas assets anyway now. So, but they're a big company, and they're headquartered in Pittsburgh. And they recently, it was earlier this month, laid off about 200 employees. So that was roughly about 25% of their workforce that they laid off at that point. So there's the producers, but then, like you point out, then there's the supply chain. So in some respects that might present an opportunity for the oil field services companies and others that are in the supply chain to come along and perhaps fill in some of the gaps that are not going to be there because of some of these layoffs. So, and they're not the only. EQT is not the only one. But if I were going to name a third story for this region, it would be the EQT story, because late last year, the former head of Rice, one of the workers at Rice Energy, Toby Rice, he was the president of Rice Energy. He and his brothers ran it, Dan and Derek. But Toby was the president, and he became disgruntled. He still owned a lot of shares of EQT. Wasn't happy with their performance, and so he set out to take over the company. And by golly, he did it. He and his brother launched a proxy fight to take over the board, and in July, at the annual meeting, they were able to accomplish that and dethroned the previous CEO and set up shop. And so now their claim to fame is we're gonna do for the stodgy old EQT what we did with our young upstart company Rice Energy. And we're gonna produce a lot cheaper than EQT's been producing, and they're changing some of their methodology and certain things like that. So that's another, I think, fascinating story that they were able to actually take over the company. So it's in a certain sense kind of like the tail wag the dog. They were much smaller. Rice Energy was much smaller. Got bought out, and then they sort of flipped it around like jiu-jitsu, and they came in and took over the bigger company.
So the pipeline protests by litigation, and what was the other one? The second one, was that the New York politics or the innovation in pipelines? What were the three stories, I guess? The three headlines.
Well, the three sort of broad, the three broad themes that I'm talking about that I see here in this region are pipelines and the opposition to pipelines, no matter where that comes from. And then the sort of the pullback, softening in new permits and drilling.
That's it.
Drilling less. They're kind of scaling back a bit and trying to be more fiscally responsible, so that they can start to generate free cash flow. And then the third one would be the EQT takeover by the Rice brothers.
Yeah, I was looking at my notes, and I had that down, and I just was I got not as many permits issued in the Marcellus. I was quickly, taking my notes here, because I know all of our listeners take notes. Of course, that's what they do. They sit around and listen to the Crude Life podcasts and Pipeline News and take notes. Right? That's just the way it goes. So, how's it looking for 2020 then? If you're talking to some people and things along those lines, people are in meetings right now. And here's why I bring this up. You've been doing this since 2009, 7, 6, you said?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, over 10 years.
Yeah, and the last time when there was a downturn, it's no secret that there is more than enough signals to say, okay, you know what, there's a change over last year. Well, there is. And so history says that, well, the last time it was a downturn, that wasn't very fun. But the first year of that downturn, man, every government official and every organization that's a council and this and that kept spouting, but we're being optimistic. We're being optimistic. I almost feel like that was not as well intended as they had hoped. And I understand the optimism, but when there's a lot of small businesses really relying on that information and you're telling them to be optimistic when it's the reality was that the first year really did cost a lot of people their business. And do you know what I mean by that? To where in the oil and gas industry, I think they would have appreciated a little bit more of a direct approach. And I hope that this go around with some of the signals that are kind of out there, that some of these leaders and appointed officials and that sort of thing will be a little more direct.
Yeah, and this is where, in some cases, it's almost like the oil industry and the gas industry is almost like two different industries. Yes, they drill a hole, the same, oil comes out of the ground, and then other hydrocarbons come out of the ground too. Natural gas and ethane and butane and propane and all of them. But for those with an emphasis on oil, it runs in a certain cycle, and those with an emphasis on natural gas runs in a certain cycle. Sometimes those cycles track together, and sometimes they don't. It's been my observation. So yeah, I saw the last sort of downturn that we went through. In fact, there have been a couple over that 10-year period of time. That's, pejoratively, the other side says we're in a boom and a bust industry. And okay, if you want to put it in those terms, I guess I'll buy, and say okay, so it's boom and bust. And so what can we do? Should we be doing anything to prevent that? I mean, the free market reigns, right? And the market will correct itself. The age-old saying, the best, the best solution for low prices is low prices. It's going to drive some out of business. It's going to cause some mergers and acquisitions, and the market will rebalance, and then it will continue on. So yeah. I guess the thing is about the shale aspect of this is it was just so new for so many people, especially like in our region. It's like, they hadn't experienced this boom and bust cycle that the industry can go through, and when it hit the first time, it really bit hard. And so perhaps people are a little bit more wise in planning ahead and be preparing for that sort of thing. I mean, I don't know if someone has a solution for it, I'm all ears, but. My recommendation, my solution is you just have to be aware of it.
Jim Willis, Marcellus Drilling News with us. And what's the website people can find you at?
Yeah, it's Marcellus, and that's Marcellus, Drilling, all one word, marcellusdrilling.com. And if they want to, I offer my headlines for free. I'm, I guess, one of those rare birds that I charge for the rest of the content. I mean, subscriptions are the primary way that I make my living. I'll put the first couple of sentences out there so they have an idea of what the story's about. But anyone can sign up for the headlines for free and just sort of track along and see, what's happening in our neck of the woods.
What kind of information do you normally put out there? Go ahead and give yourself a plug. I mean, you got a good mind for it, and you're offering a good service. So, let people know what kind of subscription they'd be getting.
Sure. Well, it's online only, so I'm not sending any paper products or anything like that. But I guess the best way to describe that is to describe sort of my process. So every day, I'm up at 5:00 and I am reviewing the news. I have a bunch of different news, filters that I'm using, and I'm looking for anything that captures my attention that I think would be interesting for someone who is interested in making a profit in the Marcellus and the Utica region. So that person might be someone that works for a producer, might be someone that works for an oil field services company or a supply chain company, might be a landowner. I have a lot of landowners that are subscribers that pay me to read what I'm writing. So I'm grabbing bits and pieces of news that's out there. I'm aggregating it for people, and I'm introducing it. I'm contextualizing it. I say, here's why this is important or what's not important. Here's what happened last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago on this issue, and here's the update for it now. And then let them go ahead and read it from there. So I in essence, the value, what I tell people, the value that I offer them is that for a very low price, $7.95 a month or $79.50 a year if you want to pay yearly, I am spending, probably 6 to 7 to 8 hours a day culling through, reviewing, and pulling out news that really is of interest to those who want to track this industry in our region and are serious about wanting to make some money from it in one way or the other. And I get that feedback a lot. You save me tons of time. I don't have to do this anymore. So that's really what I'm all about. I'm saving people time. I'm like their, full-time assistant for the cost of a Starbucks every month.
Well, I can easily see that. I mean, I'm in a very similar industry, and I'm glad to hear that you found a business model that worked. I brought up earlier, that 2009 was a big, major paradigm shift in the media industry to where the example of, take a step back and think about that. I mean, newspapers had a monopoly for 100 years in towns, and within 10 years they're going bankrupt. That's incredible. I mean, so when these energy company CEOs, I'm thinking of a John Gibson from One Oak and Harold Ham from Continental Resources, Lee Tillman from Marathon Oil, James Volker from Whiting Petroleum. And I'm not saying that to name drop. I'm saying that to give you the level of executives that are using the word paradigm shift. Those guys aren't going to use that in marketing. They're not going to use that in an interview unless they really mean that. You know what I mean? And so it's interesting to see all the different areas that's going on. We looked at technology, and obviously that's the poster child for paradigm shift. And then when you put that technology, say, into an HR department, you can see how the big data is starting to create, HR department paradigm shift, engineer paradigm shift, LIDAR paradigm shift, archaeology. It's interesting when we come to the world of public relations and perception, because that is one area where I actually have gone on a few speaking junctures to say that's an area oil and gas needs to have a paradigm shift. What I mean is,
absolutely,
we've made more money as an industry in the last 10, 15 years than any other 10, 15-year period in its history, $100 oil. We've spent more money than ever, innovation, all this other stuff. We've got a state banning oil and gas essentially with a public health setback rule. We've got Oregon trying to do the same thing. Wyoming did some restrictions on the BLM land. You mentioned earlier the politics going on in New York. We have the Green New Deal. We've got a couple presidential candidates trying to ban an industry. I mean, whatever happened to plastic straws, for crying out loud? Now we got to get rid of a whole industry? Well, that's quite a jump. I mean, that's quite a jump. That's like saying, you know what, let's let humans be in charge of the environment. That's one of the craziest things I've ever heard in my life. We can't even take care of ourselves or Yellowstone Park, let alone the whole planet. So anyway, I get back to the perception. I think that the energy industry needs to do a complete paradigm shift when it comes to how they approach people when it comes to the perception of energy. What's your thoughts on that?
I agree 100%. And my observation has been the industry tries to do it, at least those companies I'm aware of on my side of things over here on the gas side. They've tried to do it in a couple of different ways. One is, I guess the argument would be, we drill in a more careful way and in a better, more environmentally sensitive way than others do, perhaps. Another sort of tack that they take is this whole, I don't know, it's hard for me to put all this in words, but I'll lay this out how I think about it. If we start from the premise that our opponent postulates, and the opponent in this case would be, in my opinion, radical environmentalists. If we start from the premise that burning fossil fuels is causing a catastrophic warming of the earth, then we've already lost if we cede that point. Because there's the only place to go from there. What do you argue? Do you argue that, oh, well, our gas, we're going to figure out how to burn it a little bit cleaner, or we're going to be a little more careful. We're going to trap every last molecule so nothing ever leaks out of any valve anywhere, even though it'll triple the cost, to do something like that. There's not a lot of room to advance on that. So I appreciate these companies. They do not share my philosophy on this, but I do not start from the premise that mankind, by burning natural gas and oil, and coal and other fossil fuels, is catastrophically warming the planet irreversibly. And I think until we come to terms with that whole issue, we're always going to be on the losing side. I mean, we can do our best PR efforts. We can say, hey, we're doing this a lot better. Look at all these new rules we've put in place. We've joined this association and that certification group, and they've certified us as being green frackers or whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, that's not going to satisfy the Sierra Club and Food and Water Watch and 350org and all of these lunatic left-wing organizations. They are going to keep driving and driving and driving, and the point of their efforts, their focus, is that fossil fuels are evil, and that is how they want people to think of fossil fuels. And I personally say we have to fight back against that. That is just a wrong perception, totally wrong.
Well, and what you just said is exactly why I bring up anthropology. The things that I learned in college, the way societies embrace cults and, to a certain extent, religions, with a good versus evil. Yeah. I mean, even the way that the environmentalists have really positioned it, it's almost very much like the Garden of Eden. And mankind has come in and ruined the Garden of Eden. And so it's really playing a lot of the traditional Christian upbringing now. It's flipped the switch because they already know that they're aware of the original sin, and they're aware of the Garden of Eden, and now you've got Monty Burns from The Simpsons just being, the big evil lord, and it's a good versus evil. And that's where I think that the energy industry really needs to understand that, because it is not, the old ways don't work anymore. That's what I'm saying, because now it's an emotional game. And if you're trying to get at them with facts and figures, and like when I brought my 13-year-old kid to the Williston Basin Convention, and it was like a lot of people were lecturing him. And that is no way to reach a 13-year-old. Don't lecture him on why he shouldn't know better. That way doesn't work. So you got to get him on YouTube and Snapfish and InstaChat and all these other things I don't know anyway. Well, Jim Willis, Marcellus Drilling News. I'm looking at the clock here. We should probably wrap her up. Just kind of give yourself a plug one more time so people know how to get in touch with you if they want to reach out, or if they want to read what you have and subscribe and all that stuff.
Sure thing, yeah. It's MarcellusDrilling.com, MarcellusDrilling.com, and people want to email, if you have a question or a comment or anything like that, it's Jim@MarcellusDrilling.com. Those are the easy ways to get a hold of me.